Episode 122, Bekah McNeel. This is going to hurt. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I welcome back Bekah McNeel. Bekah is a journalist and author. Andrew and I interviewed Bekah for her first book, Bringing Up Kids When Church Lets You Down, in episode 91. See the link in the show notes. In this episode, I talk with Bekah about her next book, This is Going to Hurt, Following Jesus in a Divided America. See the show notes for more on Bekah and her books. I enjoy having Bekah as a guest. I find her insightful and compassionate. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed the conversation. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. We have a returning guest this time, an author that Andrew and I interviewed, I think it was a year ago. I'll have to double check my notes on when that was, but show notes for a link to the previous conversation that we had. Welcome back to Still Unbelievable, Bekah McNeel. It's a pleasure to have you. You're a journalist and author. You write well, so tell us about yourself and why you've written your latest book.
Well, thanks for having me back, and thank you. I've often said writing is my one marketable skill, so I have to do it well. It's the only one I've got. So I work as a journalist, and I cover a multitude of things. I spent a long time reporting on education and immigration, and recently started reporting more on reproductive rights, as that has become a much more fluid topic in the United States. And I started just seeing a through line in it. I started seeing, oh, wow, we do a lot to try to distance ourselves from the suffering that is inherent to our political positions. So if you hold a political position that immigrants, for instance, should not be let into the country, we do a lot of work to try to then justify or excuse or distance ourselves from the suffering of the people who are not being let in. And we have these locked and loaded, to use a very American term, locked and loaded counter narratives to the stories that we're hearing. So you hear, I spent a lot of my career writing about, hey, this policy is hurting people. And then seeing a very quick counter narrative of, actually, that person's hurting themselves, or actually it would be even worse without this policy. Actually, the law is the law, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so I had been seeing that for years in education, in immigration, in certain kinds of religion reporting. But when I saw it in the stories of women who'd had abortions or who were being denied abortions, that's when I started to go, oh, there we go. I'm seeing it so clearly here, but when I think about it, I have seen this story before. I've felt this feeling of frustration, and it makes a journalist feel ineffective or impotent, because my job is to bring compelling stories to people. And when they're so easily dismissed, I was like, what is this potent counter narrative that we keep embracing? And so I looked into it and I wrote about it.
Thank you. And so the first book that you wrote, that we had you on for over on Still Unbelievable, I'll talk about that very briefly. But listeners, if you haven't heard the conversation, check the show notes. There will be a link to that past episode. So that was about bringing up children. And bring up children when church hurts you, I think, is what the title was, something like that. So what took you from that narrative to the narrative of your current book, This is Going to Hurt, which is about what you've just been talking about the effect that some extreme parts of religion has on society in general?
Yeah, that's such a good question. The Bringing Up Kids When Church Lets You Down, my first book, is very much both books, what they have in common is that they are me taking the part of a journalistic conversation that doesn't make it to print. Like what are we talking about once I turn the recorder off? What's the subtext? That kind of stuff. You don't get to put that in a story, in a news story. Mm-hmm. And so with Bringing Up Kids, it was really where my own lived experience would intersect with the people I'd be talking to. So we'd be talking about schools or whatever, and then we'd be done with the interview and we'd get to chatting about, oh, where's your kid in school? And well, I wanted to do this because I grew up like this, but we're not like that anymore. And I just started having this conversation over and over because it was my story. People would go, oh, me too, and tell me theirs. And so that's how that one came about. And then this new one is, again, another piece of that journalistic process that can't make it to print because most reporters are not given the opportunity to say, and here's this meta thing going on. Here's this discourse that I found myself part of. It's not we don't do a lot of reflecting in journalism publicly. And so it's really more of a reflection on the stories we're not, the quiet part that we're not saying, and the undercurrents that we can't call out explicitly, because as a journalist, it's not facts. It's discourse is very malleable and very much about both what's sent and received. It's a process. Whereas a lot of times, if you're going to write something as a journalist, you have to attribute it to someone. Like, it has to either be something someone said or something someone did. And that's not always, and it lets a lot of discourse sneak through and get really tangly because it's really hard to call out. But in a book, I could jump in there and just say, like, yeah, I am seeing this. This is for sure a thing.
Yeah. And thank you. And genuinely, I enjoyed reading both books. You have a lovely, calming tone in your writing. In a world, especially in your second book, you're talking about subjects that hurt and subjects that hurt deeply. And in contrast to your title, I didn't feel the promised hurt. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, if I may do it rather cheekily, who are you trying to hurt in that title?
I love that you asked it that way. Yes, I'm hoping that This Is Going to Hurt is not a reference to the pain you will feel reading the book. I tried to make that, and actually, Erdman's, when I came and pitched the book, they said, okay, but you have to make it funny. Like, you can write a book about suffering, but you can't be suffering as you read it from the reading. And so I did try to take a very non-threatening tone of a come sit with me and talk, not a, hey, sit down and listen to me. And I'm glad to hear that landed. But This Is Going to Hurt. What's going to hurt is what I'm inviting people to do. I'm inviting people to say, oh, maybe my self-protection and avoiding my suffering shouldn't be at the heart of all of my social and political and interpersonal decision making. And so it's just so natural to make our decisions that way. I avoid suffering for me, even if that means suffering for you. Well, if I reverse that and say, my goal is to minister to your suffering, to alleviate it, to have compassion for it, it's going to mean inherently I'm a little more open to things that might be uncomfortable or painful because we have a common hope, and that you're willing to endure a little more suffering, discomfort, the various levels of unpleasantness in the name of mutual thriving and connectedness and oneness. And we just don't have a system that promotes that right now. We have a system that says protect yourself, because and if everybody just protects themselves, then the market will take care of everything. Well, it'll work itself out. And that's not the case.
Okay. Yes. If I may touch on a personal question. In your first book, I felt like I got to know you, the author, and I enjoyed reading that. And you were very open about your journalistic skills and how that was driving the book. And you switched very quickly between personal stories and journalistic accounts. And I got that in your first book. In this second book, that transition is smoother. And I think the reason why that transition is smoother is because you're writing about others. You're not bearing yourself to the reader. You're bearing other people who don't have the privilege that you've got to the reader. How hard was that for you?
That is the heaviest responsibility in journalism, is telling other people's stories. There are different journalistic techniques that can give our subjects, our sources, more or less autonomy in how they present. There's interview techniques, there's storytelling devices that create, I can really buffer your experience of the people in the book, Kendra Joseph, Jessica Minjavar, the people in the book. I can stand between you guys as like, here's what you need to know about them, or I can essentially build a platform for them to stand on and tell their story. It's mediated through me. I'm the one with the pen. And I think that when journalists don't recognize the inherent power and privilege of that, we really get ourselves in a mess and end up not doing right by the people we tell stories about. So this is a skill in this book. This book is much more about my explicit journalism. There's a lot of my actual work in here. And it just adds in that layer of, and here's what was happening behind the scenes, or and here's what happened next, and here's here's the curveball that I got thrown while writing that story. And so you're seeing much more how I do my work. I don't in my work typically bring as much of myself as I brought to my first book. It's the second book, it is truly about using your skill to help someone tell their story or present them as in their fullness, of as close to who they are as you can. And I take that extremely seriously. I've always felt like sources don't owe me their time. The amount that I can do for them is limited. And I want to, at the very least, I want them to look at the story and feel that they were accurately represented. Like that, yes, that is me. And that is how I want. Now, this is not the case. If you're running for office, if you're a person who's in a position of power and you're damaging drinking water or infrastructure, like you don't get a say in how we present this. You're still a person. I'm not going to lie about you, but I'm not going to like run it by you or something and say, do you feel comfortable with how I'm portraying you? Because the answer will be no. But if you, those aren't the stories I do. I'm not an investigative journalist. I tell people's stories. I tell stories of people who, you don't know they exist until, you don't know this individual exists until you read about them in the news. And that, I need you to know that they exist. I want you to know they exist, and I want you to have an accurate picture. And so I believe that the only way we change this, my suffering has to be avoided, yours is very tolerable to me because I don't really know who you are, is when we come together around the humanity of the people in these stories and say, when I say Jessica is being affected by this policy, I don't want to argue with you about the policy and how it affects you and how it affects me. I want us to both look at her. Yeah. And let's find our unity. If we want unity, if we want to like not be divided, let's find our unity around how do we make a better immigration system that's not tearing Jessica apart. And that's why. It's because there's no rhetorical argument I could make that is going to actually heal the suffering that our systems have brought about. It's going to have to be seeing the oneness and seeing ourselves in each other and really finding the people who are being affected. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And it leads really well actually into the next point I wanted to bring up is, because I asked you earlier about who do you want to hurt from your title of the book. The question really is, who do you want to read the book? And when I got to one of your penultimate I think it's your penultimate chapter about non-violence and embracing non-violence. Mm-hmm. And you actually encouraged me to have a moment of self-reflection. And Still Unbelievable, the podcast Still Unbelievable, especially when I do my solo shows, the brand is built on being abrasive. I self-describe as spiky. And you made me stop and think and saying, how spiky is too spiky? Because reading your book, I felt safe reading your book, but then I agree with you. You don't have to fight for my attention. So so reading your book I knew was safe for me. But I also felt that reading your book would be safe for your opponents, because you're not abrasive the same way Matthew is on Still Unbelievable when he runs a solo show critiquing somebody else. You were safe in your language, and you were making that point that you just made. Let's put our own differences aside and look at person X and see what is wrong in their life and see what has negatively affected their life. And they're currently in our jurisdiction of responsibility. So what can we actually do to affect positive change on their life? We can have the argument about how that came about later, but while they're here in our company, let them and their well-being. That really came out in your book. And I think that your political opponents will be safe reading your book, which is, I think, in today's environment, is unfortunately too rare. And so that was what brought me to a moment of self-reflection there. So whether that will change what I do, we shall see. Stay tuned, readers. Come and ask me next year if it's changed me.
Listen to subsequent episodes. And I appreciate spikiness. I get it. And there was definitely a season of my career where I would say it was like the prophet blowing in from the wilderness with a word,
Yeah.
And I think there is, I still think there is a need to make a place for anger,
Okay. Yeah.
I think that, and I talk a lot about, like, in 2020, the prophets blew in from the wilderness and said, I am not interested in making this palatable for you. I am too often let's be civil is, don't make me feel bad. Like, I want you to reassure me with one hand while you're serving me the truth with the other hand. And I think there is a rightful place in the United States for Black people, for trans people, for women to a degree, for children to come in and say, like, no, I'm not doing that. I don't want you to be able to sleep at night. I want you to be truly uncomfortable, because you're not going to change if you're not. I think that it takes all of us, because somebody has to be there once they're uncomfortable to say, all right, let's talk through what do you do with that uncomfortable? I think there was a time in my life where I felt like it was my job to do the wake up shake. And I feel like now it's my job. I'm at a point in my career where I feel called to be the one who says, all right, you're awake now. I've laid out your clothes. Breakfast is cooking. Let's get this going. You do that best as an invitation, and as a, like I had said on a different podcast, making the difference between, like, seeing a clear difference between inhumane policies and human people. It's not hate the sin, love the sinner. It's saying, I can believe this policy is reprehensible and abhorrent. You as a person are still deserving of my compassion and my connection. We are one. And the part of it, and this was a call out to me from Indigenous writers, Native American writers, international audience. A call out to me was, you can't just say, I don't want any part of you. You're not part of me. You have to take responsibility for them. You can't just cut half the country off. That's what, when Americans love to say, this is not who we are. I'm like, no, this is who we are. And that's why we have to be gentle with each other, is because we have to bring all of us along. Because a country that basically says we cut off people we don't like is a country that is constantly cutting people off and doing violent things. We have to be as kind to our ailing, abhorrently racist or whatever, we have to offer that the same redemptive path out that you would offer your broken hand. It's broken, it's smashed, it's not in working order, it's not, and it, there's some really awful stuff going on, but if you don't give it a path to healing, you just lose your hand.
Yeah.
And there's also, I'm a pragmatist at heart. That's the other funny thing, is that as idealistic as I can be, it's not working. The screaming match just isn't working. People are still suffering. Like, why aren't we trying something else? And I feel this when people are like, well, I'm tired of the indignity of having to placate the powerful. And I'm like, okay, but I don't want you to die.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to placate them either. I want to change them.
Yes.
And I want to be changed. And I want us all to be changed. And that's not happening in the current screaming match.
And that's quite disappointing. So to get onto your book then in a bit more detail, you cover the major subjects, the major obvious subjects: abortion, race, immigration, and guns. I think that's right. And you've structured the book so you tackle each subject with a pair of chapters with a very intentional thread that goes through the book, without giving too many spoilers. Could you just describe that approach to the listeners so they know what to expect when they come to pick up the book?
Sure. So what I do is I call each issue, and there's 6 issues. There's abortion, immigration, gun violence, climate change, COVID-19, and critical race theory.
Yeah.
The fact that I can now list them all without forgetting one tells you where we are in the process. It took the full year of writing the book for me to be able to remember them all at once. But each subject has a good twin and a bad twin, I call it. So the first I say, here's how we're having this conversation. Here's the stories that we're telling. Like, here's where the suffering comes from, and here's the counter narrative that we use to like push that suffering out of sight, or to justify it or whatever. And each is a little nuanced because some suffering we do hide, and that's how we get by with it. And some suffering we do excuse, and some suffering we do say is inevitable, and some suffering we simply deny is happening at all. And so that for the first chapter on each subject is kind of here's where we are, here's where the discourse is. And I break it down into components. There's different components: distance, judgment, the trade-offs that often I will allow your suffering because the trade-off is in my advantage. If I were to address your suffering, I would lose something. Or it might mean me suffering. And so there's a trade-off. There's the context. Context is really important. I try to avoid as much as I can just making it all about politics. It's very tempting to just be like, yeah, it's our hyper-partisan world, but I don't think that's true, because you're in the UK and y'all are probably using some of these same narratives.
Yeah.
I think it has much more to do with bigger us versus them rifts that we have in society. So that's the first chapter. And then the second chapter says, all right, what would a healing story look like? What would it look like to address this topic in a way that did take suffering seriously for everyone, and did take our mutual thriving seriously, and offer a more hopeful way forward? And because 60-something% of the United States still identifies as Christian, and that's the world I know the best. It's the world that I'll claim them until they stop claiming me. And so I pulled from the Gospels, because I actually do think that the character of Jesus offers a very radical approach to the suffering of others and how we address suffering. It's Jesus, and however you believe that the Gospels came to be, the overarching message of Jesus's ministry that made it through into several different accounts was, take up your cross and follow me. It's prepare to suffer. If we're going to radically change the world, there's a good chance that we're not going to get to benefit from its systems. If I'm out there trying to change the world, then the people who want you to change it the least are the ones who it's working out really well for them. So it's really hard. And that's why he says, like, it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. It's because if this is working out for you, why would you'd have to willingly lay down your life. You'd have to willingly suffer in order to change it, because it would mean a change in the systems that are delivering for you. And it's so much less personal and spiritual than a lot of our religious traditions have made it, and so much more practical. I'm going to have to vote against myself. I'm a wealthy, white, heterosexual woman, with 2 kids and who owns property and all of this stuff. I'm going to have to, in some instances, not do the thing that would be to my greatest advantage, because by doing that for generations, we have the inequities we have. I'm going to have to make some sacrifices. And that's the call. So the good twin chapters, it's funny, the good twin chapters are where we tell you that you're going to have to suffer. The bad twin chapter is where we tell you who's already suffering. And the good twin chapters, we say, and here's where it needs to be you instead.
Yes, and that comes across. And the other impression I got from reading it, and I think it's a good one, is that while in my mind, with the way me as an atheist former Christian views America, was, it's so clearly she's talking about the fundamentalist Christians. It's really obvious. But actually, you don't name and shame them. You actually give the impression in your writing that all of us need to come together to resolve this. We're not going to resolve it by one side saying we're right now and you're wrong. You have to do something about it. You actually say we have to do something about it.
Absolutely. And listen, you do not want to be in a foxhole with me, because I will quickly turn around and be like, and you, my politics personally are pretty far to the left. I'll come for my friends on the left. They're not taking suffering seriously either sometimes.
Okay.
Too often, again, right and left are political alignments. And if you truly believe that there is a political system that's going to end all suffering, you are misguided. That's all I can say. Political systems are an allocation of power, and they are inherently about governing, about saying you can do this, you can't do this. And yes, obviously there are some that are more coercive and more violent and more aligned to the interests of power and self-benefit. I'm not saying they're all equal.
Yeah.
I'm just saying none of them, the governing of people and the controlling of people and the incentivizing of people and whatnot, is never going to be the source of healing. That's not how we heal. We heal between each other. It's the people. Mm-hmm. It's not the government. We might need a government. Sure. Great. Fine. It's just not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a way that we identify with each other and relate to each other that's going to show up in the way that we vote. It's going to show up in the way that we protest and advocate and want to spend our money, our taxes and stuff. It's going to show up that way, but it's not in service of that. When you have people who are like, and that's what I argue against a lot in like the COVID chapters, is that we have said, well, this is my agenda. This is my political preference. And so whatever it says is the way to end suffering, that's what we do. And if there's something that doesn't match with that, then it must be a hoax, or it must be, that's where conspiracy theory comes from. I think if it doesn't align to what I think should be true, there has to be some other explanation, and it can get really wild. And in COVID, you saw a lot of conspiracy theory because the suffering didn't fit the political narrative.
Yeah.
You had people who didn't believe that didn't want to take COVID seriously because they wanted to follow their Republican leaders and open up shops and stuff, so that when people were dying, they had to explain it, and they chose a conspiracy theory rather than saying, I think that my political preference is leading to suffering. But you know what? It was happening with Democrats too, because when they were closing schools and then there were children who were falling into like horrific depression and bad situations at home, the response was, just frankly denial half the time.
Yeah.
And there was no flexibility. There was nobody saying, maybe we should revisit some of these policies, or maybe we should figure out a way to, do something. We need to pivot. This is going to take a long time. We can't leave these kids isolated. And so I saw on the left just an unwillingness to say, hey, the policies that we prefer are leading to suffering. And that's where, and I didn't see quite as many conspiracies. The political left in the United States is not in conspiracy land right now, but they can be. The prevalence of conspiracy theories, I think a lot of it comes from, I have an understanding of the world and I need it to be right. And I cannot live with the evidence that shows that my values and my politics are in contradiction.
Yeah. So on the subject of conspiracies, because I'm not expecting you to be able to answer this one in any kind of detail, but it's just, since we came onto it and since COVID is covered in your book, it's something that has bothered me. I'm just kind of wondering if it's an observation that you share. COVID seemed to explode the number of people who are prepared to go all in on conspiracies. Yes, conspiracy people existed prior to COVID. 9/11 and all the claims about false flag events proved that. But it seemed to be that COVID ramped up that kind of thing exponentially. So we've got pre-COVID conspiracy theory comments were at a low enough level that they were manageable and ignorable. COVID happened, bang, they exploded. Then we have, which is a subject I want to come on to because it's not in your book, but it's recent, is Trump's ear. Suddenly the number of conspiracy proponents about that are at a level that looks like 10 times higher than it was pre-COVID. Is that number of conspiracy people now the new level? And is it the fault of COVID? Because for me, that's what it looks like.
Oh, yeah. You're right in that I'm not going to be able to definitively answer it. I will say that the United States is just in a very conspiracy friendly zone right now. And I honestly do think that COVID did have a lot to do with it, exactly because of what I was saying, because there was this massive event that was causing disruptive economic and work life. Like it stunk. It was awful. And people's lives were so disrupted in so many ways, and there was so much suffering, and we couldn't fit it into our narratives of the moment. We didn't. And then I talk about this in my book, the fact that it had to go through like federal, state, local. So you had all these different governments who people were already like primed to be angry about, because it had been a really rough 4 years leading up to it. And so everybody's already like has I am for or I am against this government. And then that government is intruding in your life and telling you have to get a vaccine, or you have to wear a mask, or you can't leave your house, or whatever. Or the government is saying you can't close, like you have to open the schools. So you had a government you didn't like, several layers. So I'm in a Democratic city in a Republican state at the time, in a Republican country. It was so chaotic to try to critique a government's decisions, figure out your own, oh God, it was so rough as far as people trying to decide the politics of suffering, how they wanted to allocate what suffering they were going to tolerate. Was it the stay-at-home suffering, or was it the risk the virus suffering? And everyone had different thresholds, and everyone was primed to resist whichever government they didn't like as they navigated their own decisions. And so you just had so much chaos, and out of chaos, conspiracy theories seem to present order. It seems to present an finally a cohesive explanation. And it's especially great. Conspiracy theories are especially helpful when you need that order to be supportive of the agenda that you're still trying to promote and the outcome you want. Like, it's really hard to be like, yeah, my guy blew it. And so there had to be, and I think there's just a desire for where we are in the United States. And it's the undermining of truth, the undermining of journalism. We have, Fox News out there saying things that are nominally factual at best at times. There's this proliferation of opinion journalism masquerading as fact journalism. We already have this environment where you don't have an ultimate authority for did this happen? We're not even talking about ultimate authority of God, moral authority. I'm talking about we can't even agree on who do we look to say, the sun came up today. And so in that uncertain, low, messy understanding of the truth, really, it just became so much about what do I want to be true and how do I handle the evidence that it's not.
Yeah. I think media and responsible journalism being the sad casualty of all of that depresses me greatly. It seems that the label mainstream media is now a pejorative, and it you've just rolled your eyes. It sickens me. It's the appropriate reaction, and you try to give somebody a sensitive, a reasonable news source for something, or you give somebody a couple of news sources, which always used to be trustworthy news sources for these kind of things, written by journalists who've got a lifetime of skill in writing about this. And they say, no, mainstream media, here's a YouTube video. And I don't know how you recover. I said you, I don't know how because it's just as sickening in the UK as it is probably for you in the States.
Yeah. And Europe is going through it.
We are Europe, and it's not just UK. Europe is definitely swinging right in a way that's ugly, if I'm really honest. And this whole anti-mainstream media trend seems to be a big part of that, and people are trusting radicals over I don't know what alternative verb to use there, but over the people that we always trust on our TV screens. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but we're all suffering as a result.
Yeah, it's presuppositional apologetics run wild. In my evangelical days, we talked a lot about precept. Can you argue God to someone who presupposes that it can't be? And there was this big argument about is there the C.S. Lewis rational, you argue God as you can reason your way from atheism to theism and back again. And then you have the presuppositionalists who are no, you either believe or you don't believe. And then you argue from there. And when I look at the way people treat the media now, I'm oh, it's just I'll only believe people I agree with. Well, how do you know if you they're literally saying, like, I already know, and I only accept information that aligns with what I already know.
Yeah.
And then I have that information. And how do you know? Well, I heard it. Well, how did you believe it? Well, because I already agree. It's the most mind-bending environment to work in. And again, it's part of why I wrote the book, because I was writing stories where I'm like, I am on the Texas-Mexico border. I am looking at this child in the face. And then to read the conspiracy theory of, like, there's actually no children at the border.
Yeah.
They're all plants. And I'd be like, I'm right here.
Mm.
And it's
And we have this, and we have the same dilemma here in the UK over people on board, although our border is a little bit wider because there's water there. But we have the same problem with people arriving half drowned, and people on the beaches don't want them there, don't want to help them, want them to go back into the water and do the journey backwards. And the lack of compassion. When I was a Christian, I sat in multiple sermons where the pastor literally said, if it doesn't hurt you to help someone, you're not helping them enough. Right. Or words to that effect. And that was the Christianity I grew up in. That help hurts. If you can give more, because they have even less. And that was the Christianity I loved through all my teenage years and through half of my adult years. And now I look at Christianity, and yes, those Christians still exist. I'm not denying they exist, but they are being completely shouted down by the Christians that say it's their choice that they're there. Why should I help? And I don't recognize that. I struggle to recognize that.
I truly believe a thing that happened with evangelicalism in the United States and probably around the world is that there's not really a strict definition of what it is. You kind of just get to claim it. And it's not, I was just talking about this with someone that, like, Catholicism is a pretty set system of what it means to be a Catholic. And you can't just go around being like, oh yeah, I'm Catholic. You have to be, like, inducted and confirmed into the church. That's the word I was looking for. And evangelicalism is totally different. And the mass, that Christianity that's shouting right now, the ugly side, the white Christian nationalism, stuff like that, is very largely drawing from evangelical traditions. They're not entirely, and there's some Catholic stuff going on in there, and some, I guess, mainline, but it's largely evangelical. And what's happened is that because no one can say, no, that's not Christianity. What you're saying is Christianity is not. Look, this is evangelicalism is this, if that's what you say you are, and this kind of loosey-goosey like, there's no nobody's driving the train. It's just a dozen people trying to gatekeep it in their own way. There's no pope, there's no authority structure, and I'm not saying that that's a better way, but it has generated a certain kind of chaos where you can have people wanting to shut out immigrants in the name of God, which is absolutely absurd. But it is a result of a kind of make it up yourself Christianity. And you as an atheist and me as someone who is, like, very ambivalent about the term Christian these days. I'm kind of like, whether you call it Christianity or you call it something else, they're doing it in the name of what they believe. And I get the soreness of other Christians saying, that's not my Christianity. But I'm just kind of like, well, at the end of the day, whatever you call it, I don't want to fight for the brand. I don't care if Christianity has a good reputation. And that's where like I differ from probably the church life that I came from, is I don't really care if Christianity has a good reputation. I care if if there are people in the world able to live that life that Jesus set out and offered. That's good stuff. And I want people to be able to do that and have communities that do that. But if you don't want to call it Christianity, because the brand, frankly, right now is getting just dragged through the mud, don't call it that. You know? But people just want the brand. And that part kind of baffles me, because I'm like, it's about how you live. It's not about how big your tribe is. It's not about whether you get to say like, oh, there's this many Christians in the world. Like, who gives just go live the way Jesus lived. And if a bunch of people are doing that and can find each other, they can call it whatever they want. And that's fine. You know, I sympathize. I get it. I get where the people are like, oh, I want Christianity to be identified with compassion and welcoming immigrants and all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't really care what you think of Christianity, just to have compassion and go welcome immigrants, you know?
Yeah. So I'd like to veer a little bit political for a bit, because here in the UK, we all look with bemusement at the political scenario going on over your side of that big puddle of water. Although we've had our own blonde bozo, messing up the country as well, and we had our own single issue election over Brexit. So I guess the first question I'd like to ask from your side, looking at us, did you guys look at us voting for Brexit in a single issue election and then watched how that savaged our economy? Did you look at that and go, wow, those Brits are weird? Or did you just not care enough?
Oh, no. We looked very much and went, oh no, you caught the virus. It was okay, your average American, God only knows, getting people to know who their city council person is a tall order these days. So I can't speak for the average American, but I do in the political discourse and the people who are watching and whatnot. And Brexit was very much part of the vernacular, it was on our, just part of our Twitter feeds, part of our conversations. And the conversation was definitely a like, oh shoot, it's not just us. This is spreading. And I think people are very worried about that, because this is no less threatening to us in the UK or Sweden or Germany than it is here. This extreme nationalism and with religious fervor and all of that is globally bad news. It's not good. It's how wars are born, and nobody wants that. And so I do think that the destabilizing energy of it is a familiar, troublesome, doesn't bode well. And I think that there's definitely Americans who are concerned about that. Obviously, on our other side, there's Americans who are like cheering them on and being like, yeah, finally, maybe I will go to Europe one day. The godless continent. But I think I'd say we're wincing with you.
Thank you for that. I think where we're different in the UK is those divisions are less obviously religious. They're much more classist than they are religious. And I think that's because unbeknowingly, because I wouldn't have said we were a class society, but I think we are still living off the, I was going to say benefits, that's completely the wrong word, but we are living off the repercussions of being a class society of years ago. And I think that obviously still affects our politics today. And so Brexit, I'm convinced, was a symptom of that rather than a symptom of national religion.
And I will say this too, as someone who actually loves religion, I love faith traditions and the idea of connecting to God and humanity on a scale other than what is seen. I love metaphysics. I love spiritual I love that part of life. And I am very pro-religion in its most peaceable forms. I will say that watching Europe struggle with the right, struggle with extreme political fascist, tendencies and cruelty and seeing that happen without the super religious emphasis and using the religious language is, to me, a great proof point that this is in the hearts of men, and we are going to co-opt religion just like we will co-opt science. And that's because people are like, oh, but science. And I'm like, dude, science has been brought into this fight plenty of times. I'm starting to believe in science, religion, all of that as kind of amoral. There's not an inherent morality to it. It's how you bring it to bear on our relationships with each other and with the earth. It's what you do with it, because the morality is about how we treat each other. And you can do good and bad in the name of God, and you can do good and bad in the name of science and in the name of all sorts of things. And so it's for me, seeing Europe go through it without the religious trappings and gasoline on the fire, I'm like, all right, I think there's actually hope for religion.
Okay.
I think, we've proven that it's not the variable.
Yeah, I can see, yes, religion can be saved in a way that to be something that's non-destructive. I absolutely will grant that. I think what bothers me about Brexit, and I'll get back to how this links in how we view the United States, but what bothers me about Brexit, and specifically the right-wing party that brought it about, is their next step is taking the UK out of the European Convention of Human Rights, which I think is an utter travesty. I didn't see that coming 4 years ago. And then I started hearing murmurs, and I thought, no, they can't be serious. And then now, well, actually they are. So thank goodness that's not going to happen for at least 5 years. But I am pretty sure that conversation is going to come back, and that bothers me. So as a European observer of what's going on in the United States, I've seen guns and gun rights, which is a strange phrase to say, completely dominate your politics. And there were a couple of moments, and I think you mentioned the Uvalde Travers tragedy, in your book. And I think that was one of them, but there was also, I think Sandy Hook was one of the other ones. There seemed to be a pivotal moment where there seemed to be a greater number of people saying, we really got to do it. And then for whatever reason, momentum got dissipated and it just didn't make its way into the political strings. And I keep wondering, maybe there'll be hope, but now I see abortion looming on the horizon. And I'm wondering if now you've got issues. You've now got guns and abortion. And I'm wondering if abortion is now going to lead to something else, maybe contraceptive rights and things like that.
Yeah,
and I'm
we're
wondering
bracing
if you're
for
on the
whole
slope.
shebang.
And I'm wondering if, we're on the slope from Brexit to human rights to whatever comes next, you guys are on a slope through a different level of subjects, but we're still on the same slope.
Gosh, that's so well thought out. I really appreciate the way you're thinking about this. Yeah, 100%. Okay, let's start with guns. I say this in the book. This has been said a million times. If Sandy Hook didn't change the conversation here, nothing will. Nothing will. Those were little kids, and they were just. It was the first time we'd seen the mass killing of little people, and if that didn't lead to major radical change, I don't think we're capable of it. And I have had many times looking at certain conversations in the United States and saying, oh, this is a structural problem. Because if democracy was working the way they tell us it works, this would have changed. But we have this structural problem where the gun lobby, the power of the NRA, the power of the gun industry, and certain mythologies and political alliances operate independently of the will of the people. I look at Texas a lot. Texas is so much more conservative in our policies and our representatives than we are in our citizens and what the citizens want. Guns have more power in Texas than there are gun owners. You imagine when you look at Texas as a gun state, you should imagine that everybody's got a gun on their hip everywhere you go. And that's not actually the case. And a lot of people are for common sense gun laws. And it's not the like Wild West that you think it is. But there are mechanisms. Gerrymandering is a great example, but like there's a lot of the way primaries are set up, the way our electoral system works. And then when we have decisions at the Supreme Court, like Citizens United, that just make it a money free for all, we've got all these structural things that circumvent what we thought democracy was supposed to be, which was like we all just vote and whatever ideas most people like is what happens. And that's just not what happens. That's not how it works. So I get a little grim when I think about it all, because I'm like, yeah, we have set it up so that it's not a simple majority that's going to get anything done. It's going to take like really massive majorities to overcome the structural safeguards that people have set up to make sure the system keeps working this way. And that's not to say that Americans don't love their guns. They do. But it's largely because we've got this mythology that it's up to you to keep yourself safe. And that's just absolutely bonkers. And I didn't even realize how bonkers it was because I grew up with it. You grow up in this and you're like, well, of course you need a gun. How else are you going to defend your house? And it's just wild that is like the world that Americans live in. And so so there's that. And so I don't know that we're on a slippery slope as much as that's one that's just locked in place. And I look at it and I think like this is going to take more than like, yes, we could probably muscle through it would not take a lot to muscle through some very common sense gun laws. And I think that politically that could be achieved. But the larger problem, the bigger stuff in the United States is going to take time on guns. It's really deep in our mythology. Our systems are not built for change. It's tough. Now, abortion, we are absolutely on a slippery slope. IVF has already come under fire. It's going to get weird because, already with IVF, as soon as they come for it, there's lots of people have used IVF, and that's a lot of people have their children because of IVF. And so coming for it is going to get way more uncomfortable. Starting to come for contraception will be interesting. But I think certain kinds of abortive contraception, IUDs, certain kinds of like the morning after pill, that kind of stuff, for sure is going to be on the table, because right now at this point it's truly just, and I honestly think there are some true believers in there, but the majority of the people driving this legislation and driving this movement are people who know that being the most pro-life candidate is a big win to get votes. And so you can just come up with, okay, what's the next most pro-life thing, until you're basically like just using the U.S. Conference of Bishops to draft your policy. And so I don't think we're done on the slide with abortion. I think with guns, it's more of a like, what else? I literally don't know what else could happen or how we get out of this. It is such an entrenched thing.
Okay. My flip side observation, and maybe this is where there is some hope, my flip side observation is because of what I do, the social media activities I'm involved in, I see a lot of people exiting Christianity, specifically exiting fundamentalist Christianity. Almost every single one of those people is deeply hurt and deeply affected by their experience, and that's driven their exit. And every single one of those is, I'm going to change my language. Every single one of those is pro moderation, is pro the attitudes you put in your book. And so my hope is that as that part of Christianity continues to dwindle, continues to hemorrhage these kinds of people, the voting base will change. And that is where the change will come from. And you said a moment ago that people get elected because they just say, oh, pro-life, and boom, they've got the votes. Those votes won't be there forever. Mm-hmm. And in 20 years' time, that will not be a guaranteed ticket. And maybe that's the hope.
It's spoken like someone whose country has been there for thousands of years instead of 200 years. Yeah, no kidding. I do think if we can keep the planet going for, a couple more generations, I definitely think the next couple generations of Americans coming up are way more moderate. They present themselves as quite radically left right now, but I think they will. Oh, maybe. There's times where I look at it and I'm like, as someone who, again, considers yourself pretty far to the left, I'm like, are you for real? Are you going to hang in there? But at least getting rid of that, of the political capital that there is to be gained by absolutely irrational pandering to right-wing activities or like ultra religious niche views and whatnot. I don't want to call being pro-life niche. It's not, but like the belief that an IUD is an abortion is pretty niche, or that, stem cell research is mass murder. Yeah. That's out there. And I think that stuff could easily be ushered out with a generational change. I don't know. People are like, talk about demography as destiny. And I'm like, yeah, some ideas have a sneaky way of finding a new audience. So we'll see.
Okay. I'd like to take this opportunity because you are the first person with journalistic credentials I've had the opportunity to chat to since two major headline incidents have happened in recent weeks. But talking of recent weeks, reminder to listeners, your book that we're discussing, This Is Going to Hurt, was published 2 weeks ago now. Did it go out?
July 16th.
July 16th. So 2 weeks ago, as we're talking, link in the show notes, listeners. That is the pretense under which I've got Bekah here. Do read the book. I am fortunate enough to have read it without paying my own money, but it is a book that is worth paying my own money to read. So please, if you listen to this, go and buy a copy, enjoy the book, find Bekah on social media, links in the show notes, tell her how much you enjoyed the book, tell her I sent you, and maybe I'll get to talk to her for the next book. So, recent event. Let's start with the gunshot. I wasn't expecting that. And what's most bizarre about that event is I recorded an episode 5 weeks prior to that of Still Unbelievable, chatting with two people. We talked about politics, and I said, very tongue-in-cheek, what you guys need is an assassination. Then I edited the episode, I queued it up to publish, and then 3 weeks later, it published on the Sunday of that weekend. Then I got an email from a listener saying, please wish him much fortune in his next life. And just to be clear, yet again, that's not how I want things to go. I do not endorse that kind of behavior. But I think I have an idea as to the kind of toxic political rhetoric which leads to that event, but you're there, you're in it, you're reporting on it. What's your take on what happened?
Oh,
Or
that's
what led up to it?
Yeah, it's American gun violence at its finest. It's the desperate belief that the only way we can get out of this is to kill somebody. That is just the most American response. And so yes, while we were all a little surprised that that the assassination attempt was on Trump, I think everyone was surprised a little bit by that. Like, oh, we really thought it would be the very, very pro-gun side going for the other side. But at the same time, I look at that and I think, yeah, he's a 20-something, I forgot how old he was. He's a kid.
Yeah.
Who has been told his whole life that, you know, he hasn't probably been told by his parents, but we've been told by the discourse, the media, and I mean Hollywood, our entertainment, the American zeitgeist, our mythology, our everything. We've been told that vigilante justice is sometimes the only justice. The only way we save ourselves is if we save ourselves by killing the bad guy. You know,
it's in every great American movie.
He saw himself as the good guy with a gun.
Yeah.
You know, and whatever mental health, you know, et cetera, mythology greets mental unwellness in specific ways. Whatever was going on in his mind, chemically, structurally, whatever, was met with the mythology of this is what America needs. This is what I need. This is what our country needs. This is, you know, if I'm wrong, if he was just a guy who was out to kill somebody, I don't think I am, but you know, there are easier people to take aim at. If he was some kind of, none of the reporting on the shooter struck me as someone who was looking for an attempt at getting a spotlight when he died, and he had to know he was going to die. Yeah. That's the thing about mass shootings, is that like they are suicidal on some level, whether it's through like recklessness, like you're either being reckless with your life or you're deliberately going out. And so whatever level of delusion or whatever was going on, it intersected with the mythology of the only way out of this is if that person dies. And that's not an uncommon thought. And in a country where it's really easy to put a gun in your hand, you have the means. And in a country that gathers together for events and for rallies and stuff, you have the opportunity. It's means, motive, opportunity. Motives there's abundant motive, whether you're trying to be the hero or you're trying to be the good guy with the gun who takes out the bad guy with the bad policy, or whatever your motivation, there's always going to be the opportunity, because we're going to keep gathering. And so the only thing you can really strike at is the means. Like, you got to keep guns out of people's hands.
Yeah.
You know, there's always going to be assassination attempts, and you just hope that they've got a knife and somebody can knock them over. And the thing is that, like, yeah, he didn't kill the president, but he killed somebody else.
Yeah.
And it's the result of an American society where it's just too easy to put finger to trigger. And you can't, and the mythology is there to help your motive of, I want this person out of the picture, to be connected to this is how we do it here. And then it's from there, it's just easy peasy. And that's, so when I don't, I don't know if it's the heightened rhetoric that led to it, because everybody's like, obviously Trump just basically became a victim of his own side's rhetoric. Like, yeah, his side are the gun people, but at the same time, I'm not ready to put it on the Republicans. This is American. This is how he came to be. Was putting guns in the hands of settlers and saying, go defend your homestead, go be the good guy with a gun. This is all of us. This is not just Republicans.
So yes, thank you for that. So what was it then that drove, again, this is my perspective from the UK, what was it then that drove Trump's spike in popularity after that event?
Oh, everybody loves the survivor. I think it was the fist in the air, the defiance, who does
that? You've just been shot because it did hit him.
It did.
Who then fights through their security detail to fist punch? Who is so unself-aware that they would do that?
Look.
Sorry, I know the answer to that question because it's on TV.
Yeah, no, well, here's the thing. I don't think it's revealing too much of myself as a journalist to just say, like, I find nothing about Trump palatable or worthy of leading a country. I despise the man. I will say his eye for a moment, his ability to read the room, his room, is not bad. That was a brilliant move. It was brilliant. It was people are getting that tattooed on themselves. That will be on every Trump flag. It is the moment he seized, like, for as terrifying, frankly, as that must have been, the adrenaline or cortisol or whatever came through his eye for the media moment. I was stunned. I was like, oh my gosh. Like, I don't see that as unself-aware. I see that as like a master media person who knows how to capitalize on a moment. And the love of, like, the cowboy masculine strongman ethos in that camp is terrifying. I've spent time in the rallies, and there's a lot of testosterone going on. It is very muscle man, cowboy John Wayne.
Kudos to you, Becca, because I generally can't see myself feeling safe in the vicinity of something like that.
I went down. Texas Monthly assigned me to follow the God's Army on a border convoy. This story ran in February. They went down and they were going to go protect this ranch that was being besieged by immigrants, they said. And so all these this huge convoy of people, very MAGA, very lots of Confederate, not as many Confederate flags, lots of like 1776, like these people, lots of Christian nationalism. And I drove down to this remote ranch on the Texas border, way far away, middle of nowhere, and parked my little rental car and walked past people selling body armor, people selling like every kind of flag you can imagine, some of which were extremely anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, like, wow. The whole deal. I walked through the whole gauntlet of it, and then get in and had to identify myself as a member of the media. It was absolutely terrible. The whole time I was walking in, I was like, why am I here by myself? What am I doing? At the same time, the only thing about me that was in danger was being a member of the media. And I'm not the more I just also have this like I grew up here. Like I know you people. I know and I went and talked to the lead organizer of the entire thing, and he and I emailed afterward, and I just said, look, my only goal is to represent you accurately. And he was incredibly kind, and we had a great conversation. He was like, I really don't want to talk to you because I don't trust you. And I was like, that's fine. Like, what can I do to help you feel safe? And we had a great conversation. I don't agree with anything this man believes personally, but at the same time, I think that you just have to have an awareness that like the risk to me is an unpleasant getting harassed at my car. The risk to me is somebody spitting at me. The risk that these people pose to the suffering at the border is massive. And that's for me the moment of like, it's uncomfortable. There's a lot more people looking at me than I want to be looking at me. There's a lot of side eye going on, a lot. But at the end of the day, like, they're not going to touch me. And I knew that. And I think that we have to really lean into like, there was a U.S. one of the great like liberal lions of the U.S. Congress. At one point it was a really dark time for immigrants. There was a lot of deportations, and he just looked at me, and I don't know if you do video, like your listeners can't see me, but I'm about as white as they come. And he just goes, he's older and we had a good relationship. He goes, kiddo, it's time for those of us with blue eyes to stand out front so they won't shoot. And he was speaking metaphorically, but at the same, and I don't know. I think I have to step back from the drama of it all and the discomfort and the queasiness and just say, whatever I'm feeling right now is just going to have to step aside because there really is work to be done. And I think that that's the call on everybody to like, no, you might not want to go to Thanksgiving with your uncle that you find abhorrent, but like suck it up and go because there's other people who can't go. There's the people who his policies actually hurt, the people who his votes actually hurt aren't at his Thanksgiving table, and you are. So, be kind and have the conversation.
Thank you, Beck. And side note to listeners as well as myself, this is what real mainstream journalism does. People go out to places that are dangerous and deeply uncomfortable. This is not about research on the internet from the safety of your desk. This is about actual boots on the ground, talking to people. And sometimes you don't know what will happen next. But that's journalism.
Yes. And it's a privilege.
Thank you for what you do. So I'm very conscious of time. There is one more question I wanted to get in, and then we'll see what we do in the wind down. From the points that I was making earlier then, how is Trump being artistically depicted as Jesus something to be celebrated and not offensive, but an Olympic opening ceremony is deeply, deeply offensive?
Among my friends, when the Bacchanal was mistaken for the Last Supper, I was like, we already have a problem. We already have an education gap here that we're really showing. Good heavens. I don't know. The ability of people to be offended by things like they see drag queens who they do not like and are inherently like, I inherently dislike, not me. They inherently dislike them. They think they're offensive. So pretty much anything the drag queens do is offensive, and their presence there and their welcome there is offensive. So you already have that. And then it's almost like they're primed to look for some kind of something to legitimize how offended they feel by the fact that these people exist. So there's that. The Trump is Jesus thing. I think there is a genuine belief, not that he's Jesus, but this is like a person who was ordained by God and is God doing God's work. And so like, because they like what he's doing, he gets to be as, he can take whatever icons and imagery he wants. And if they don't like your politics and don't like what you're doing, then you come within 10 feet of a Christian symbol or Christian language or whatever, and it's going to be highly offensive. But the killer, I was laughing with friends. I was like, yeah, being uneducated and oversensitive is a really fantastic combination. Like that just killed me.
Yeah, I'm still bemused by it all. I think for me, the most amusing comment once by somebody who is quite a well-known Christian actually likened that moment in the opening ceremony to cancelling Christianity. I think for me that was where I managed to my ability to comprehend what was going on failed me immensely at that moment.
Well, here's the deal. Like, if you go around looking for a place, where can I say this? I'm looking because I know that that's going to rile up. That's a great soundbite for that person. And so they're going around and just looking for, where can I throw this in? And it was a misfire, honestly. Like, the facts didn't like. Somebody posted, my favorite meme coming out of the whole thing was somebody posted one of the men's gymnasts on the rings. And you know how they will extend their arm and kind of hover between the rings?
They
and
call it the crucifix. Yes.
Yes. And somebody was like, here they are again, these stupid Olympics making fun of Christianity. And I was like, spot on. That's the thing. Is that just like, you go around looking for, where can I inject my sense of outrage? Because outrage drives clicks, drives retweets, drives whatever you're trying to drive. Outrage is everybody's favorite thing. And so you just go around looking for something to be outraged about, and it's silly.
Yeah, sadly so. It must pain the people like yourself, because there's lots of you who feel that Christianity has so much to offer us culturally, and it's being decimated by those who are most noisy.
Yeah, I don't know, though. I'm kind of the mindset of like, if we need to call it something else, let's just call it something else. Like, I don't know that I want to fight. I'm perfectly willing to go present something that I see as like, actually, this is Christianity, and I'll put it out there. But I'm not going to go out there and say that what they're doing isn't Christianity, because like, Christianity is an evolving thing that kind of is what you make it. And if that's the direction it's going, and somebody wants to call what I'm doing something else, go for it. Like, I'm game. The future cannot be a defense of something that other people are trying to co-op. It has to be a willingness to make something new. And I think that more than anything is what I'm advocating in the book.
And you do it so well. There were other things I wanted to talk about, Bekah. I wanted to touch on a bit of Christian nationalism. I wanted to touch on CRT, because I know that is a big thing. And I know lots of very vocal Christian voices are raging loudly and continuously against CRT. And I wanted to touch on that. Our time is running away. I'm sorry, listeners. I know you'd have wanted to hear Bekah's wisdom on that. Do you have another book on the horizon? Will I have another opportunity to have a conversation with you?
Let's hope so. I'm pitching new books. I can't talk about them just yet, but I think that I will say I've been devoting a lot of coverage to reproductive rights, and my books follow my coverage. Okay. So that's always possible. Been getting really interested in the growth of the psychedelics movement in the United States.
Right. So interesting. Yes.
We could go that way. There's some things on the horizon, but you can have me back anytime. Just check on Sojourners or Texas Monthly, and pretty much any news story I will come talk about for a little while.
You heard that, listeners. If you haven't heard enough of Bekah and you would really like me to have another conversation with her, Usual email address, reasonpress@gmail.com. Tell me what you want us to talk about, and we'll see if we can line something up. So just before I let you go then, Bekah, last time we had you on, I asked you our usual question about a favourite Bible character, and you brought out Moses. I think you are still the only person who's mentioned Moses. You said there are elements of Moses' character that you appreciated in the way that he achieved things. Is that still how you feel? If I was to ask you the question again, would you give a different answer? Would you like to nominate somebody else at zero notice?
I still stand by, still a big Moses fan. Still love Moses. I gotta say, and I mean, this is about as cliche as it gets, but writing this book, I spent a lot of time with Jesus, and I think I came around to a new appreciation for Jesus as a biblical character, not necessarily, Son of God, the Christ, but actually like the dude, Jesus the guy.
Right.
Okay. And enjoyed that.
All right. Okay. So if I can give you a quick dichotomy on that, then is this Jesus meeting the woman at the well, or Jesus overturning the tables in the temple?
This one is the Jesus that I came to appreciate was the more of the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The way, I think it's John Dominic Crossan who is it him? It's either him or Bart Ehrman. Talks about Jesus as an antinomian Messiah, the guy who shows up and breaks the law to show that the law is corrupt. I'm digging that pretty hard these days.
Okay, I will try to find that, and if I find it, it'll be in the show notes. So have a look there, listeners.
I'll find it and send it to you.
Awesome, thank you so much, Bekah. I've genuinely appreciated the last hour and a half. I hadn't realized the time had gone quite that quickly. Thank you for writing that book. This is Going to Hurt. It's the title. There is a subtitle to that book as well. Check the show notes for both of Bekah's books. Please do go and buy them. Do appreciate her prose. I'm not a big reader, but I did enjoy reading Bekah. Thank you once again, Bekah. And listeners, reasonpress@gmail.com is the usual place to find me. You've been listening to me interviewing Bekah, and until next time, be reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.